Hi class. Today I'm going to speak about Ben Franklin and the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was known as the Age of Reason, and it began with the founding of the Royal Society, which was for the promotion of the study of science. In general, the emphasis was on reason as a power to correct and moderate the passions. It wasn't that the emotion or passion was not an important factor in the Enlightenment period, or that it didn't exist, but rather that it was subordinate, of course, to reason. Of course, there was a renewed or continued interest in Greek and Roman cultural models. We see this most evident in the neoclassical architectural style evident in Washington, D.C., with its landmark Ionic and Dorian capitals. Some thoughts and political events of that century was, of course, Thomas Hobbes' famous statement that the divine right of kings was suspect, that kings, in fact, arise out of human need and not divine ordinance. The cartoon, of course, is from Calvin and Hobbes, with, of course, a very eminent Hobbes superimposed. Politically, in England, the restoration of Charles II saw the end of the reign of Oliver Cromwell and the Protestant Revolution. Of course, continuing tensions between the Cavaliers and the Puritans continued. However, we talked a little bit about this with the conflicts between William Bradford and Thomas Morton. Civil conflict in general was greater than between nations than within nations than between them. Here are some of the famous Enlightenment thinkers. And on the left, we have a few key statements. John Locke, here, is best known for his ideas regarding tabula rasa, the idea that people are born as blank slates. However, he also was a political philosopher, and he was attributed with the famous statement that our greatest aim as human beings was the pursuit of life, liberty, and property. Thomas Hobbes, right here, of course, had a very skeptical view of human nature, that they were naturally bad. And then, of course, his opponent, Rousseau, who is actually influential to the thinkers in the Romantic period, believed in the eminently good nature of human beings, corrupted by civilization and training. Voltaire, here, let's see where Voltaire is. Voltaire's right here. Voltaire was an author who wrote Candide, but his famous political statement arguing for the freedom of the press, of course, is key here because of the advancement of the avenue or the venue of free discourse. In philosophy, the trend was towards a reevaluation of God's place in the universe. It wasn't that God was innate in human beings, but that in fact he was innate in the works of his creation. And some of the philosophical arguments used reason to prove that. So Leibniz is credited with philosophical optimism, proving by logic that this is the best of all possible worlds. In Newton's exploration of natural law and order, and in particular those experimentations with light, proved, of course, more credit to the creation, and he was the first to understand the rainbow, that, of course, white light was a combination of all the different colors. John Locke, of course, I've already mentioned, is credited with the idea of tabula rasa, that experience inscribes knowledge. And, of course, we come to deism, which is, right here, deism, is best understood as the belief in an impersonal God. And a writer, philosopher by the name of William Paley is the most famous with crediting or at least coming up with this analogy of the watchmaker. God is like a watchmaker who creates something and then puts it into perfect order, just like a watchmaker creates a watch and lets it tick. It does not need the watchmaker to intervene. Of course, there were several arguments against this idea. Thomas Hobbes, of course, wrote an argument, or actually David Hume, the philosopher, wrote an argument against it. And later in our own 20th century, we had Hawkins dispute this. Of course, the watchmaker analogy is offensive to most atheists. Here's a picture of Sir Isaac Newton and his experimentation with light. Of course, here's a famous couplet from Alexander Pope. Another very central idea to the Enlightenment philosophers was the order of creation, and this gets articulated most famously in Alexander Pope's essay on man. And of course, in Pope's essay on man, he more or less advocates and puts central the great chain of being idea. That is, that all things are created by God in a particular order, and that this particular order takes the form of a chain, and this chain has all the characteristics of a chain. Plenitude, i.e. the idea that all things have been made, that could be made. Continuity, there is no break in the links. And finally, gradation, the idea that there is a hierarchy. Now, the other aspect of Pope's essay on man, which was important for the Enlightenment thought, was that evil was a choice to reaffirm free will. So the essay on man is very optimistic. We are in the place that we should be, and that if there is any bad, again borrowing from philosophical optimism, it's subordinated to the greater good. And here is a picture of the Great Chain of Being from 1579. Once again, this is a very old concept, and it is continuous throughout history. However, the Enlightenment philosophers made much of it. And the idea, of course, is that it was a very conservative system. We are in a place, and we shouldn't try to overcome it. We should not try to be better than what we are created by God to be. And I do apologize because there is some ambient noise, and I will introduce on the right my little dog Buster drinking his water, and on the left my dog Sydney shaking herself and making herself generally known. You may hear occasional barking. All right, so once again, just to repeat and to reinforce, the principle of, and I'm going to help you out here a little bit, plenitude says that the universe is full, exhibiting the maximal diversity of all kinds of existences. The principle of continuity, whoops, an extra U, forgive me for that, is that this chain is composed of an infinite series of forms, each of which shares with its neighbor at least one attribute. And then finally, the principle of linear gradation says that this series ranges in hierarchical order. The Enlightenment in America was very much influenced by the English thinkers Locke, Newton, and Hobbes, who saw God's hand in nature. Of course, as you know, Hobbes and Locke argued against the idea that knowledge of God was innate in man. However, that did not necessarily defeat the idea of argument by design. But if truth be told, the colonists were more, especially the writers of the Declaration of Independence and our first Constitution, were more influenced by the Scottish Enlightenment figure Thomas Reid of the Scottish Common Sense School. And I suppose if I were to put in a nutshell, that idea is basically these two quotations, one in yellow and one in red. And let's start with this idea, that every conjecture we can form with regard to the works of God has as little probability as the conjectures of a child with regard to the works of an adult. Is very skeptical about abstract philosophy. And in terms of language and the effect of truth and its relationship to language, He says there is no greater impediment to the advancement of knowledge than the ambiguity of words. So let's not get too carried away with our writings. Let's talk clearly and to the point. Thomas Jefferson, of course, wrote that nature's God reveals his design through the orderliness of creation. So again, reflecting this deist philosophy, it's a corollary of deism, this intelligent design. Virtue is not hereditary is also a shadow or an echo of John Locke's idea that knowledge is ascribed and virtue is ascribed by experience, and we aren't born with it. All right, so basically this is the Great Awakening, and basically George Whitefield over here, whose picture shows us that he was cross-eyed because of a defect according to childhood measles. The Great Awakening was basically led by George Whitefield in England, the Methodist Anglican preacher who is barred by churches and university. And basically, his method was very charismatic, and so many people flocked to his sermons that he could no longer, by necessity, preach in churches and took to the fields and streets. Jonathan Edwards, the famous late Puritan preacher, had a similar experience in Massachusetts, but on a much smaller scale. The bottom line is that the Great Awakening was the Great Awakening to passion as an avenue to belief. And here are some more pictures of George Whitefield preaching. Again, the whole idea is that people were having tremendous fits in their moments of epiphany and acceptance of faith. The relationship between Whitefield and Edwards was cordial, and of course both men were deeply affected by their meeting when they finally did meet. Whitefield did learn from Edwards not to be so hasty about judging those preachers who didn't subscribe to his methods. So Jonathan Edwards, who normally I have you read in more depth, was really a very key figure in the Enlightenment period. He applied the ideas of John Locke, and under that influence, he created a work that showed, on a philosophical level, the importance of the emotions, bringing us to a knowledge that was felt rather than just simply known. And of course, here's a meme. There is nothing that keeps wicked men at any one moment out of hell but the mere pleasure of God. And this, of course, is from Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Jonathan Edwards' timeline here, and I'm not going to spend a long time on it, but I just wanted to let you know that he was another one of our prodigies who entered Yale at an early age. He became a minister very quickly after and was incredibly influential. Now, towards the end of his life, he was dismissed by his church because in the wake of the Great Awakening, even though he did accept the religious or the emotional emphasis, he was concerned about the great numbers of people who were coming to the faith without the kind of attention to traditional doctrine, specifically that of communion, and the idea that one had to make a formal confession of one's faith before one was accepted into the church to take communion. Again, Edwards' theology was influenced by Locke, and basically the key point here is that he wrote this treatise concerning religious affections, which was a subtle philosophical accounting of the place of emotion in religion. And again, this was an attempt to address the controversy over itinerant evangelical preaching. And now, let's talk about Ben. Well, he had many faces and many roles, and he crafted these primarily through, of all things, language. So his first identity or persona again, was that of autodidact. That is someone who teaches himself. Franklin began at an early age to educate himself in reading and writing skills. He decided that he was going to live moderately, and I don't know if you remember the anecdote regarding his vegetarianism, but it is so hopefully a passage we will encounter tomorrow in our reading of the autobiography. But in the bottom line, he learned ways to save money so he could spend more time studying and advancing himself. He began his writing career by submitting articles to his brother's paper under the pen name of Silence Dogood. These published articles were popular, and of course, they didn't know for a while that it was Ben writing them. Of course, this also led to the controversy which dismissed, or at least brought before the court, James Franklin. It was decided that because of whatever issue it was, and even Ben doesn't remember exactly what it was a political complaint, decided that he could no longer publish this newspaper under his name, so they went for a loophole and gave it to Ben, so Ben could publish it. But this newfound authority was improper, to say the least, because Ben was still indentured to his brother and an apprentice. But Ben promised to behave accordingly and enter into secret indentures with his brother. Well, when it came time to leave, which it did a few years later, Ben didn't come through on the deal. By rights, he shouldn't have been able to leave because he was still under contract, but he never actually entered into that contract. And of course, this is one of the reasons why he says he created a great errata or mistake as regards the treatment of his brother. Of course, he was a consummate rhetorician, and in our autobiography, one of his methods of rhetoric was that of the diplomat. He said, "I was charmed with it," that is, dropped my abrupt contradiction and positive argumentation, and put on the humble inquirer and doubter. Of course, he was charmed by the readings that recommended such an approach. Benjamin Franklin was an independent entrepreneur. Working for his brother, at the age of 17, he did break his indentures, as I said, improperly, but he couldn't find work in Boston because no one would hire him because of his behavior. So he went to Philadelphia and settled there. He was a troublemaker and an independent spirit. He went to London for a short time, and we read about that experience in the autobiography. And in 1729, he acquired the Pennsylvania Gazette, and in the first year became the sole publisher and owner. Here we encounter Ben Franklin as the farmer's friend. He's known this way primarily as the author of Poor Richard's Almanac, a book published yearly with information of interest to farmers. And of course, this is where we have his witty sayings, such as "Early bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise." And here are a few more. I don't know if you've heard them before, but some of these are pretty good, such as "Well done is better than well said," and particularly this quotation, "Up, sluggard, and waste not life, in the grave will be sleeping enough," which translated is, "You can sleep when you are dead." He was a scientist and inventor, and I suppose of all of his attributes and personas, this is what he was best known for. It's hard to argue. He's known for so many things. But of course, when we were children, we learned about his experimentation with electricity, and also his invention of a few devices, such as the Franklin stove and bifocal glasses. Of course, there's that lovely picture for children. In his later life, Ben Franklin became a community servant. He started or initiated a number of civic institutions, such as the fire department, the University of Pennsylvania, and finally, the lending library. Of interest, of course, is his late life joining of the Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery, and in our reading on the slave trade, which I have now made optional, of course, he does, in fact, rehearse the arguments that were being spouted off in Congress about reasons we shouldn't abolish the slave trade. And, of course, that piece is satiric, and he writes in the persona of a Muslim man who supposedly made the same arguments against Christians who were being taken slaves 100 years ago. Of course, the Muslim persona is fictional, and this whole situation was fictional, but not the arguments themselves. They repeat almost verbatim some of the arguments against freeing the slaves that went on in the Civil War period. Ben Franklin was a politician. Now, I am not 100% sure, but I think that this cartoon was actually created by Franklin. But what we do know, of course, oh, Sydney, be quiet. See, she's getting anxious because I've been talking. Anyway, he signed the Declaration of Independence, and he was successful in getting grants for the American war effort. He died shortly after his political career came to fruition in 1790. And of course, he is an iconic figure in American culture and literature. But what most of my students do not realize is the extent to which he influenced literature. This is a picture of the Liberty Bell from some years ago. I want to say this is 2008, and this is my son when he was a child. And here he is again in the Franklin family pew. He's not exactly excited to be there. And this is the Franklin family tomb. This is in Boston. So when you think of Ben Franklin was a citizen of both Boston, where he originally came from, and Philadelphia, where he became famous. All right, so this is where his parents are buried, but he himself is buried in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. In fact, I visited his tombstone. All right, and this is the death mask of Benjamin Franklin. It was a common practice to make masks of dead celebrities and famous people. All right, here are a few recommended websites regarding Benjamin Franklin. I did put this PDF under Sakai Doc Sharing, so you can actually access it later to take notes or to follow up any research interests you may have. And that is that. We'll see you tomorrow.